Thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll give a quick agenda, just brief overview of what we're going to go over today. We're proud to have many of you joining us. We want to ensure that we have enough time to get through all of the content. And because of the size of the group, we're going to ask that you put your questions in the chat along the way, and then we're going to address them all at the Q&A session at the end. But in order of operations today, we'll start off with a couple of introductions, an overview of cloud structure. We'll discuss when a domestic violence case becomes a domestic violence case, talk about some fair housing to-dos, the importance of consistency and documentation, and then how surveillance technology can help in situations like domestic violence cases. As we get started, I do want to just take a moment to emphasize that, like most of our liability webinars, whether it's our pool safety related to children at a communities or aging residents or domestic violence cases like today, some of the data and content can be a little delicate. So I think for everyone to take away from today is a feeling of empowerment, right? To leave here having the knowledge and the tools to ensure that you're able to find a balance between compassion as a human while also protecting your communities, your on-site teams, and your properties. So as we get started here on introductions, I'm Peter Rail. I'm Director of Sales here at Cloud Structure. And while I may not be an expert in security or an expert in liability or risk management, I am an expert in security cameras, but we're very grateful to be joined today by experts as Melinda Macbeth, counsel at Offutt Kerman, who has a deep expertise in multifamily housing law, fair housing compliance, and property liability. She advises operators and managers and owners on the legal frameworks and government resident relationships and property risk. And we're also joined by Megan Davidson, who's the Senior Vice President at Alliant Insurance, who's a leader in multifamily insurance strategy and one of the nation's largest insurance brokerage firms. And she works with property owners and managers to identify coverage gaps, structure liability programs, and respond to emerging risk trends. So I will start off with Melinda and let you introduce yourself.
Okay, well, thank you for having me again. It is a pleasure to meet everyone, even though we're not talking about the funnest of topics today. My name is Melinda Macbeth. I am an attorney with Offutt Kerman. Offutt Kerman is one of the fastest growing civil law firms in the country. We have offices in 10 states right now. We have almost 300 attorneys. We do basically everything civil litigation related. I am part of the landlord representation group, so I specifically focus on multifamily housing, landlord issues, and I practice in the state of Maryland, specifically in Baltimore.
And then we'll pass it over to Megan.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're chiming in from. So appreciate you being here and taking the time really to invest in the safety and security of your properties. We protect at Alliant more than 3.5 million multifamily units annually. I am someone with particular expertise in affordable housing, but also do market rate. And what we're seeing is just some real upward trends in violent acts on premises. So this is a very timely subject for us. So thanks for joining.
Yes, thank you both for the introductions. Always great to see you. We're very happy to have your expertise along the way through all the different webinars that we host. We can jump ahead just a little bit here. So a little bit of an overview of Cloud Structure if you're not familiar with us already. We are a fully integrated cloud-based surveillance solution that is developed to bring peace of mind to operators and residents alike. We maximize the capabilities of cameras by integrating our award-winning AI that categorizes all activity on a property 24 hours a day. And then we compare that with our remote guarding, where we have trained operators watching some or all of your cameras during the hours you request to provide a real-time proactive protection that stops unwanted activity by either sounding a talk-down speaker or coordinating with police for a rapid response. So whether you have cameras already or looking to add them, we can help provide visibility and certainly reduce uncertainty. So as we get into the content of today, I know discrimination complaints have gone down slightly, but retaliation complaints have doubled during a very similar time frame. Melinda, would love to start with you. What happens with fair housing discrimination complaints?
So, fair housing complaints and retaliation complaints sort of have an overlap. It's pretty frequent that someone will file a complaint alleging fair housing discrimination, and even though that at the conclusion of the investigation, the regulatory agency will find that there was no discrimination in those acts. If the landlord takes any action while the complaint is pending, like non-renewing the person's lease and potentially increasing their rent depending on the circumstances, then it's not uncommon for the regulatory agency to determine that while there was no discrimination, there was retaliation and in response to that complaint. I see that happen, unfortunately, a lot. So it is important to be careful, not just how you approach these from a discrimination, fair housing standpoint, but that you always keep in mind the potential for a retaliation claim, because they can often pop up together. They will go hand in hand, even though you can distinguish them definitionally. In practice, they sort of work together.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And Megan, I know 3 years ago or so, you were talking to our team about domestic violence cases, and they were one of the bigger challenges for insurance carriers. Is that still the case? And if so, why do you think that is?
Definitely. So I'm going to say that domestic violence falls into a category that insurance companies refer to as assault and battery, which is sort of a catch-all for anything that may happen on site, that a violent type act. And it seems as if during COVID, there was a ramp up of activity. And I don't know if that was people being in too close contact with each other or what it was, but we really saw some major increases. So what insurance companies did as a response is, when they see these upward trends that they hadn't planned to underwrite for, they also hadn't priced accordingly. So with the increase in claims, what insurance companies' first response is to say, oh, wait, we're either going to limit or exclude coverage for assault and battery claims. Well, that's a major problem for most people, because when there's an incident on site, often what happens, depending on how the incident is handled, is somebody wants to sue the owner, or they want to sue the management company, or both, because that incident happened. And whether or not that's a valid claim is besides the point, because even if it's not a valid claim, you end up having to do investigation and defense potentially and that sort of thing. So it's a very real issue. We're not seeing a decrease in these type of claims. It's continuing on the rise. So the other issue, I think, is, how did management respond? Like I mentioned, what happened after the incident happened is all very, very important. So on the rise, all types of incidents, something to be afraid of.
As kind of a follow-up to that, as after a domestic violence case starts, how does the property manager draw a clean line between a genuine lease violation and the perception of potential retaliation?
Carefully.
Yeah, exactly. That's why we're having particular procedures in place makes a big difference, right? So you need to have procedures in place. You need to follow them consistently every single time. If you handle one case differently than another, then the parties could potentially say, listen, that was discrimination against me. You handled my case differently. You listened to what a neighbor said. You didn't even look at the footage, the camera footage. There were no reports turned into the police. There was nothing of that nature. So how do what is your procedure, and do you follow it consistently? So that should be very, very clear.
Yeah, it's important, I think, to have written policies for how your site teams are going to handle these things, and that consistency is then becomes the key. You need to follow those procedures to the letter, make sure everyone understands what the process is, and make sure it's followed and documented every single time. That's how these cases are won and lost, is lack of consistency and a lack of a cohesive policy.
Yeah, and for those joining us today, you will hear consistency and documentation a lot. And so those are going to be some key themes as we move forward. But lastly, here, before we move on a little bit, Melinda would love for you to tell us a little bit about the Violence Against Women's Act decision that was made by the DOJ and settled this April.
Sure. So in April of this year, the DOJ's Civil Rights Division announced the settlement of a first of its kind lawsuit regarding the housing rights part of the Violence Against Women's Act. Basically, the allegations were that the landlord had unlawfully evicted a tenant after she called the police requesting assistance during a domestic violence incident. There was not any determination of the actual facts because the case settled, but the landlord agreed to pay the defendants $25,000 in damages to the survivor and her children. There are also additional conditions that were placed on the landlord. They cannot file any sort of adverse credit reports against this tenant. They have to complete VAWA compliance training. They have to report any rental property acquisitions to the Department of Justice for 3 years. So basically, they're going to be under a microscope for the next 3 years. Everything that they do is going to be very closely watched by the federal government. So it was a big deal because it was the first time that this particular section of VAWA had really been enforced by the DOJ. And even though $25,000 is by far not a nuclear verdict as we typically define it, it's still a pretty big deal that it happened at all. And it brought new scrutiny to landlords and how they handle domestic violence incidents. Not just the incident itself, but you're going to hear us say this a lot today. It's what you do after the incident occurs that is really where you can get in trouble.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue. So would love to kind of clarify what is meant in terms of retaliation.
Right. So retaliation can mean a lot of different things, but broadly, it's illegal punishment, coercion, threats, or intimidation by a housing provider against someone who's exercising their rights under VAWA, whether they're reporting a violation, they're participating in a proceeding, they have requested some sort of protections under VAWA, like an emergency transfer. If a tenant complains about what they perceive to be a VAWA violation, like they file a fair housing discrimination complaint, and then the landlord does something adverse to them after that, that's potentially retaliation. Any type of adverse action against a tenant after they testify or help in an investigation into domestic violence is potentially retaliation. If the tenant asks for some sort of an emergency transfer or enforcement of VAWA protections like a lease bifurcation, and the landlord says no and then turns around and gives that person a notice to vacate, that's a pretty clear retaliatory action. Landlords cannot evict or threaten to evict someone because of their status as a victim of domestic violence, because of an incident that occurred to them on the property. Landlords cannot raise rent or diminish services because of domestic violence. There can't be any harassment, intimidation, or coercion. And you can't refuse to renew a lease simply because someone has been the victim of domestic violence. All of those fall under the retaliation category, and they will go pretty badly for you.
Yeah, and of course, for us speaking so heavily about consistency, what does consistency actually mean in practice for these types of events and incidents?
You'll hear us both say all the time that documentation is key. These cases won and lost on your tenant files. When a case gets brought to me as the attorney, the first thing I ask for is, in addition to the lease, is the incident reports. If you tell me that there are no incident reports, I'm not going to be very happy about it. Contemporaneous documentation, as close in time to the incident as possible, is best because we want to know your present sense impressions, what you actually saw, heard, smelled, tasted, all that kind of stuff. The further out from the incident you document, the more likely those things are to be challenged. People's memories fade. In a stressful situation, once the adrenaline drops, you may have a different interpretation of what you saw and heard than what you think you saw and heard immediately after it occurred. I think the same is going to be true for insurance agents. They're going to want to know what is in your file and how solid it is. The more you have, the better your chances are in defending any type of claim.
Right.
Yeah, I'm glad
And
you
I
said
would,
that, Megan. I would love to ask from a risk standpoint, why is inconsistency such a problem? And what is it that you would want to see in the property file?
right. And this is funny. For those who are parents, I have a 28-year-old daughter, and consistency is everything. And sometimes repeating yourself is the thing with kids. You think if you tell them 10 times, it'll sink in better. So you're going to hear consistency from us a lot today because it's that important. So a couple of different things I would add to the property file is I would say encourage the resident to make a police report, if at all possible. Encourage them. If there's a protective order in place, have that in the file as well. And then really key, retain any video, find out right away what the timing of the incident was and get that video pulled and save it. Super, super important. One of the issues that can be a problem in these situations is that you have a lot of turnover of staff. So typically at a property, the average turnover is 35% a year. So when you think about that turnover and changing staff, if you don't consistently keep records in the same way all the time and have that list in front of you and have that list complete for any incident, there's potential for that site manager to be gone, a regional manager to be gone, and a lot of evidence to be lost. And it's rare that there are incidents of domestic violence or assault and battery on premises that we don't hear about it one way or another, and that somehow the owners and property managers are brought in. So super important to get the information right away. And as Melinda said, everyone's memories start to lag after time. So getting those reports right away is very important.
Yeah, of course. I can tell you from doing a couple property assessments a day, they start to blend in, and one gym starts to become another gym in your mind. And it's like, I was just there a few hours ago. But real quick, a question for both of you guys. How much video would you ideally want? Just the incident itself or more? And I guess as another question, how often are property managers consistent or inconsistent?
Ooh, the inconsistency, I'll tell you, because of that turnover, if the staff isn't properly trained, it's a problem. So there is a serious inconsistency. I have incidents that are reported 8 months after the fact. Well, by then, staff may have changed. Lawsuits are the first trigger that something happened, and the evidence could be lost, right? So sometimes those videos are overwritten every week. So depending on how the information is stored, that can be an issue. But again, those memories change, people leave sites. I would say the inconsistency in reporting and how those reports are received, I rarely see one incident that looks like another and one file that looks like another. So in my perfect world, this procedure to address domestic violence should be the same in every property.
Yeah, and that's why having written policies are important. Mostly to deal with staff turnover. You can train one person and then 6 months later they're gone and the new person doesn't know the procedures that you need to follow. I'm a big fan of forms for incident reports, logs for phone calls and in-person interactions. That way everything is consistent. Sometimes it's not going to work. If there's an emergency, someone jots down a handwritten note and throws it in the file, that's fine. But it's much better if you follow that up afterwards when you get a moment to breathe with a formal incident report. And if all of your incident reports look the same or substantially similar, that's helpful in litigation because it shows that you've got uniform procedures that you follow all the time. You're not just doing things on the fly as situations arise. Even though there are sometimes fair housing pitfalls in that, I'm sure you guys don't want to talk about this today, and neither do I, but discriminatory impact is a thing in some states now. but you want to be able to have a policy that is hopefully does not have any sort of discriminatory result at the end of it, that you just employ every time. That's routine, non-discriminatory reasons for the policy, and then an even application of it across the board. All your properties, all your tenants should be treated the same with some exceptions.
Yeah, so it sounds like a few small added steps can turn into miles pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So as we move on here, let's talk a little bit about when a domestic violence case becomes a domestic violence case. So I know there's a lot of scenarios where, there's a possible domestic violence case that's either witnessed via the cameras, or someone hears an argument next door, or someone on site sees something of one of their neighbors. When it's time for the property manager, when they do get involved, can you kind of walk through what that looks like and how they should address that appropriately?
Sure. In my experience, a lot of times property management finds out about a domestic violence situation from the neighbors. The people who are living right next door, they're the ones that are going to hear the loud arguments at night, the slamming of walls and belongings and things like that. So most of the time, it's going to be other residents reporting that they hear disturbances, and then it will sort of slowly become clear what type of a situation you're dealing with here. Sometimes property managers will hear or witness it themselves, but it's not overly frequent in my experience that the victim themselves will be the first one to report it. It's usually someone else who's not involved, who's an outside observer, who will let you know. Officially, under VAWA, it's not really a domestic violence situation until you have some sort of objective proof, whether it's a restraining order, whether it's in some states, they have what they call qualified reports from third parties, like a doctor or a counselor or a domestic violence organization that is helping someone. Once you get that, then it verifies who the victim is, who the abuser is, and the risk levels often. So that's when you really want to kick in and perk up and do something about it. But if you receive a report from the victim or from their neighbors that this is going on, then that's when the wheels should start to turn in your head, and you need to start planning, because you know that it's only going to get worse. Domestic violence situations can sometimes be a slow burn, and they can sometimes be a fast burn, but they're always going to ramp up incrementally. It's not going to be a one and done situation. There's going to be more than one instance of domestic violence that occurs typically before action can be taken, or the victim even asks you to take action. So just be aware that you're starting to circle the drain of domestic violence situations the second that you get put on notice that there's fighting and disturbances going on. Doesn't always mean it's domestic violence, but more often than not, in my experience, that's what it is.
So I have an example that I think probably some of you can relate to, but it happened to be in California, but I've seen these all over the country. In this particular instance, there was a fellow whose mother was living in senior housing. It happened to be affordable housing, and he would go to visit her regularly, and every time there would be loud arguments, and it was disturbing the neighbors. And at one point, one of the neighbors walked out of his door. This fellow was coming out into the hallway. He had heard loud banging next door, the neighbor had. Comes out into the hallway and here's the son leaving the residence. And the son goes to attack the neighbor. The neighbor obviously said something, but the son attacks the neighbor, and the neighbor retaliates. Next thing you know, the son, who was the original aggressor, goes to sue the owners of the property and the managers for allowing this violence to happen on premises. Fortunately, there were cameras in the hallway to catch all this. Also, fortunately, the property managers had a history of complaints from the neighbors about loud noises, and they were in the process of evicting the mother because she would not take action and was allowing this son on the premises when they'd asked her not to. So everything was done, the file was documented, and it was also clear from the video, which was super important, who the aggressor was. And so all that documentation, and then backed up by the visuals, made a tremendous difference in how this is viewed by the court. So not everyone has cameras in their hallways, but I would tell you, save their bacon. Absolutely save their bacon on this one.
Yeah, it's a great example, Megan. And then Melinda, from your perspective, for a camera scenario, what's the safest thing that a property manager can do with what they know?
If you're asking what to do if you know you have cameras
Yes,
that
if
are
there's
capturing it.
something where a camera was able to capture an event, but maybe you didn't hear anything from a neighbor, but you or your staff saw something on the camera system, at that point, what is the safest thing that your team can do?
Oh, from a
Sure.
legal perspective is what you're
Well,
asking.
I think actually Megan is right. Save it. You know, like I said, oftentimes there's going to be more than one incident that occurs that you're aware of before you're really able to take action. Sometimes there's incidents that occurred before the incidents that you're aware of that you will never really have details on. Usually it's been going on for a while by the time it gets on a landlord's radar. But if you notice something on the cameras, save it. Just put it in the file and document it for the file. That's as far as you have to go right then, typically. I will also usually say to landlords that you should not get involved in interpersonal disputes between your residents, whether it's a familial dispute or neighbors fighting. Don't get involved in that unless and until there are actionable lease violations going on or someone puts you on notice of a domestic violence situation. Now, if you come out in the morning, you're doing your property walks and there's holes punched in the wall, go to your cameras, check and see who punched the holes in the wall. That's a lease violation right there. It's property damage. That's something you can act on. But if it's just reports of we heard fighting again, I would document it and not do anything else at that stage other than just document that you got the complaints. Maybe you let the leaseholder know that you received complaints about their unit, and then don't go into details with the complaining neighbors. Acknowledge the report, encourage them to continue reporting anything that they hear or see, but don't disclose details on what you're going to do after that. We'll get into that more later. I just jumped the gun a little bit. Sorry, Peter.
No, that's okay. Again, that's, for us in our perspective, there's unfortunately sometimes where things do leave a residence unit and then spill out into common areas and things like that. But a lot of times it is behind closed doors where there is no visibility. So we'd love to hear from your perspective what the danger is to jumping from we've received a complaint to we know what happened mindset.
I mean, I think that's where you potentially run the risk of discrimination, also retaliation. If you come in from an accusatory standpoint, whether the person is the victim or the perpetrator, then it usually doesn't go well. Even with the victims, if they're confronted with something before they're really ready to admit it, they're going to get defensive and they're going to defend their abuser and try and protect their abuser because they've been conditioned to do that. So it's important to just sort of objectively write down everything in your incident report. I don't necessarily want you to make conclusions about who the aggressor was and who the victim was. Just document what you see, what you heard. If there's video, make sure that you save the video. And I want the full context of the video. Go back to before you see anybody on the cameras at all, and then pass the incident to where you stop seeing people on the cameras, because that way you can avoid any claims of like, well, this is taken out of context. You didn't see what happened leading up to this, so on and so forth. I want to see the whole picture. I know it's a pain to save all of that footage all the time, but it is better safe than sorry. And you want to have it at the end of the day, rather than have to tell your lawyer or your insurance carrier, oh, well, we do have cameras, but we didn't save that. So we can't really prove what happened or what didn't happen.
Yeah, those don't want to go to any sort of a conclusion, right? That's where consistency, documentation makes all the sense in the world. And then Megan, if let's say a property had issued a notice that was just solely based on a neighbor's accusations, what about that would make you incredibly nervous?
Oh, nervous. First of all, everything should stay private. You should never share information about anything happening on premises. And also, this leads me to another thought too. Never promise in writing the security of premises either. So I know that sounds like an odd question, but I will tell you on every application, when you look at a habitational supplemental application, it says, did you promise that there would be secure premises? Don't do it. I mean, you want to provide a secure safe place, but don't promise that. So I think keeping things private, writing things down, holding on to that information, not promising legal protection to a victim of domestic violence, not promising their safety, and don't do immediate lease changes without proper legal backing are all really important. Don't make promises about evicting an abuser without a court order. Don't don't agree to withhold rent payments or share private tenant data. All those are really important. So yeah, strict privacy is everything. Fast safety actions like new locks, clear lease choices like offering to break a lease without fees. Those are the sort of things you should do to help and support residents versus promising anything else.
Mhm.
Yeah, of course. And I'm glad you touched on the confidentiality portion of that as well, and kind of talked a little bit about some do's and don'ts, which is a perfect opportunity for us to move forward here. I know, Melinda, you had mentioned that you just went through this with a client, and even though the abuser was carted off to jail, I know you described how difficult it is to get the abuser evicted since he didn't or hadn't been convicted yet. Can you talk a little bit about why and kind of what the loads of witnesses and the abuser has committed multiple crimes? Like, why is this still so difficult?
In this scenario, I think one of the biggest difficulties was that the abuser was not actually a tenant of my client. It was the victim that is a tenant of my client. And law enforcement were contacted multiple times because the issues spilled out to affect the rest of the community. There was vandalization of vehicles going on in the parking lot by the abuser. This individual went so far as to kick in doors of neighbors with knives in his hands, screaming that he was going to kill them. But when law enforcement came, they were reluctant to help the landlord issue some sort of a trespassing ban to this individual because the law enforcement officers believed that he had established occupancy, basically that he had squatters' rights, so that they could not ban him from the property legally. They took him off to jail. He gets out of jail. He, lather, rinse, repeat. He comes back to the property. He does the exact same thing. The landlord issued their own trespassing ban to this individual. It didn't work. They were, of course, very hesitant to take any action against the victim because this person was the victim. But after a while, it came out that the victim was inviting the abuser back onto the property after he had been banned from the property. And there were continuing and escalating criminal incidents. So right now he is in jail, and I don't think he's getting out anytime soon because he's now been charged with home invasion. But it is a concern because eventually he may get out, and then he's probably just going to follow the victim right back to her property. We unfortunately did take action against the resident, the victim, because of her lack of cooperation with law enforcement, because of her continuing to invite him on the property. And again, I, from a personal standpoint, understand that that is something that victims of domestic violence do, and that they are conditioned to do, is to let this person back in, give them more chances. It's a cycle of abuse, right? So that one is very difficult. But in that one, you had to weigh the overall protection and safety of the entire community against the rights of this one individual. And since it's still ongoing, who knows where it's going to end up, if there's going to be a retaliation claim or a discrimination complaint filed. It's entirely possible that there will be. But right now, we are still in the process of trying to ensure that this person does not ever go back onto this property. And it's pretty clear that pieces of paper, stay away orders, are not something that really gets through to him in his brain. But at this point, we finally did convince the victim to go and get a protective order against this person. So that will help the law enforcement enforce if and when he shows back up on the property. It will help the landlord to take steps if and when he shows back up on the property. It's just a very delicate balance of factors there, where your main priority needs to be the safety of all residents, and then talk to a lawyer. If you have a situation like this, I strongly recommend that you consult local counsel, because every state is slightly different in how they handle domestic violence. Underneath of VAWA, you've got your statewide protections that are sometimes different from what VAWA is. So just make sure that you consult with local counsel, you coordinate with law enforcement, and you provide them with the footage if they request it, all of those kinds of things, just to make sure that the safety of all of your residents is being protected to the best that you can.
Yeah, that's absolutely a heartbreaking story, and I appreciate you sharing. Is there ever a time where this can become a security negligence case by other residents because they are involved?
Absolutely. If and that is my standard property premises liability and negligence. If the danger is known or foreseeable, the landlord has a duty to take steps to try and prevent it. Sometimes it can be as simple as just making sure you got cameras, surveillance cameras on the property, or better lighting if things like this are happening in darker areas of the property. Just make sure that you have all of your compliance and your reporting procedures in place. Consistency is the key here, to show that you are addressing these things as they come up and you're addressing them uniformly. That way, as long as you can show that you are doing something, if the situation warrants it, that goes a long way towards cutting down on liability, in my opinion. Megan, I'm sure you have thoughts about this too.
Yeah.
Yeah, Megan, I would love to turn to you. How is a property supposed to retain confidentiality in a situation like this where there are multiple parties and multiple residents involved, and also preserve fair housing integrity?
So this is it's a great question, because there are two elements at play here: confidentiality and then maintaining fair housing. So you have so many cases. In fact, I would venture to say almost every single one of my cases where you have a resident suing the premises, they end up throwing in a fair housing complaint. So your first responsibility as a manager or owner of a property is to keep the property as safe as possible without putting that in writing. Also, you are supposed to protect your resident. So by mentioning to your resident, I can't talk to you about what just happened, but we're handling it, so that they don't make comments on any incidents happening. Nobody sticks their foot in it. And then what you can do is to ask anyone who witnessed an incident to make a police report, so that it's coming from more voices, so that the complaints coming from more voices is really important. Also, you don't want to take any action against the victim of violence in any way. So following kind of the letter of the law, being familiar with VAWA as to whether or not it applies to your property and how it applies to your property is really important, and following that procedure and then documenting it. If you follow the procedure to the letter of the law, it's really hard for somebody to make a discrimination case. So all important.
Yeah, definitely a difficult balance. And I think the key is what we've talked about, which is documentation and consistency, right? So I think, Melinda, you once told me that 1 in 10 of the property managers that you dealt with had jotted down police case numbers and documentation. What does that mean for the rest of the documentation trends, and what are the biggest gaps?
I think incident reports, I'm starting to see more of them, so it gives me hope that maybe people are coming to our webinars and they're listening to what we're saying. But, contemporaneous notes to the file. Obviously, I've already said I prefer form incident reports, but I'll take anything in certain situations. Most important thing is that it is documented, that it makes it into the file, and that it's as contemporaneous to the incidents as possible, and it has as many objective details as possible. I don't want your team members' personal thoughts about who the aggressor was and who the abuser was. Just straight up objective. This is what we heard. We heard a man yelling. We heard a woman yelling. We heard two people yelling, whatever it is. If you get complaints from the neighbors, make sure that you put those in the file and you document them, because a timeline is going to become important at a certain point here. I would also encourage them, if the other residents, that is, if they are hearing loud fighting or disturbances, particularly late at night, to call 911 and to report it to the police. Oftentimes the police will come out, they'll just take a report and they won't really do anything about it. But that way there's a paper trail, right? And it's more than just your paper trail. Now there is a 911 phone call log of all of the reports that they got. You can't go into details with the neighbors about exactly what you're doing and what's going on, even though sometimes I know it is tempting to do that, but you can't, because confidentiality is something that is also a part of VAWA. You have to protect the rights and the personal information of the victim here. So my suggestion to that usually is blame me, blame the lawyer. If somebody says, well, what are you doing about this? We're working with our attorneys, and our attorneys have advised us that we can't really speak about specific steps we're taking right now. Blame me. I never mind. If they call me and ask questions about it, I'm very good at ignoring tenants. Like, I'm very good at it.
So Megan, if you could, have management teams add one thing to their risk management process, what would it be?
Yeah, it would be an official incident report, and it would be consistently used throughout the organization. I would let anybody know, listen, your insurance broker can customize one for you if you don't have one, but it should be available to everyone. And ideally, you would have that in the cloud or in a central location. The other issue is if they're official police reports or protective orders, you want those in the file. Emergency contact forms in case something happens for your residents would be really important. And also copies of written safety plans or lease changes would be important to have in the file. And then last, definitely not least, videos of any incidents. It's the first question I asked, anytime something happens. So you can imagine if you see a video of something, it has an impact. So those
Yeah.
would be
So
the key. Yeah.
as a follow-up to that, how often do you see property management and ownership groups having all the footage you're hoping for when faced with these claims?
Less than half the time. Less than half. Some people have cameras. Sometimes those cameras aren't even operational. And at other times, they don't have enough cameras. So they're not in the spaces where something happened, or they're not close enough. So having a really good plan for how those cameras are deployed and how that documentation is saved so that it's not overwritten is really important. So that early reporting is also important so you can save the video documentation right away.
Yeah, and Melinda, from your perspective, what footage is needed for a domestic violence case beyond like just the actual inciting incident? Do you need more context or witnesses, or should you scrub footage from previous incidents as well?
I always want context for everything. More context you have, the harder it is to challenge that and to say, well, you didn't see what happened 5 seconds before the video clip, but before this clip happened, that there was something else going on. So as much footage as you possibly can. I know it's a pain in the butt, but that's what really, really helps me. Megan and I have already said it a couple of times, but some type of incident report, standardized form that everyone uses so that everything is consistent, that helps as well. Encourage people who are witnesses, residents, to send you an email, even if they don't want to call the police, which I understand a lot of times residents don't want to get involved. Have them just write down what they observed themselves and shoot it to you in an email. It's not going to necessarily absolve them of testifying in court if it comes to that. They're still going to have to come in and testify about what they wrote, but at least that way you've got it in the file and you can see sort of the progression of the way things are going one way or the other.
I wanted to throw out something else too, because cameras alone are great. They're great, but there's also a feature that I have found I know for a fact it would have saved someone's life. There was an incident in Atlanta where you had a group of young men standing around. It turns out they were doing a drug deal, but all of it looked shady. Neighbors saw it. They had cameras on it. Had they had a talk down feature, it would have changed the trajectory. There was a young kid, a high school kid. He was on the honor roll, doing everything right, walking across the property. These kids doing their drug deal ended up pulling out guns and shooting at each other. They shot and killed this teenage kid. And he was just an absolute pillar of his community. It was an affordable housing property, and this kid had great hope. Had there been the talk down feature in those cameras, it would have asked that group to disperse, and it didn't happen. And this is violence on premises that just could have absolutely been avoided. So I have become a big advocate. And this is not the only incident where something like that happened. I've become a big advocate of the talk down feature in cameras too. In a domestic violence issue, if you see something happening, if you see, especially with live monitoring, if you see someone coming on premises that's an issue, you can take action right away, and they know they've been seen, right? People who do this do it in the dark. They don't want to be seen. So it's not just a matter of having the cameras. What is your system? Where are the cameras? Do you have a talk down feature? All those things are really important.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that you touched on that, Megan, because I think that the way we've built our solution here at Cloudastructure is to check all of those boxes, right? I know that there are parking lots, surface parking lots by me, where they have an automated talk down, where anytime you walk by, it's like a motion light that turns on and starts yelling at you. But our ability to integrate a live talk down feature that can be used by our remote guarding team to say, hey, you in the blue pullover, stop what you're doing, or police will be called, really gets your attention. You know that there is truly somebody watching you. They are making sure that whatever this suspicious activity is doesn't escalate to gunfire, right?
Right.
And similarly, we allow on-site property managers to use our talk down speakers as well. So if we're not watching the cameras during the daytime and you see something, you can jump in, use the speaker, and make announcements. Doesn't always have to be for bad things. It can just be, hey, it's 9 p.m. Pool's closing soon. Get your things and get out. So there's a lot of versatility there, right?
Yeah, I have a degree in risk management, and I can tell you, and I know that Melinda would say the same, in our perfect world, none of this would happen. There would be deterrence, there would be prevention, and we wouldn't even be talking about the end result in a lot of cases. So that would be the ultimate goal.
Yeah, of course. And then that's really what we would, like you said, it's an ideal world, right? We know
Yeah.
things aren't always going to be perfect, but
Yeah.
what tools can we implement? What knowledge can we implement along the way to give us the data that maybe we don't see, right? And that's where cameras are fantastic, because sometimes you won't know that something's happening on the property because it's not being reported by a resident or the neighbors, but you have cameras and then you'll actually be able to see it. So that's really where combining that AI analytics, being able to quickly search for over 100 different AI tags, allows on-site teams to get the video that they need really quickly. And then you add in things like license plate recognition, facial recognition in different jurisdictions where it's legal, and people have trespassing affidavits or restraining orders, where you can then jump in real time to have them removed from the property. Really creates a solution that de-risks the property as much as we possibly can, and get us closer to the ideals that we're all searching for. Cool. So next, I know we've got a quick video of just a demo of the Cloudastructure platform.
Hello, here's a quick demo of our software. Let's start with the live view page. When something happens on a property, management needs immediate visibility. Cloudastructure gives you a real-time view across the entire property from anywhere in the world, so you can quickly understand what's happening and take action. Next, let's look at how remote guarding works. The monitoring page is where trained security professionals respond in real time when suspicious activity or another potential threat is detected. In this example, as soon as the two individuals with a crowbar are spotted at the front door, the guard would immediately make an announcement telling the individuals to leave and letting them know police have been contacted. On our facial recognition page, management can identify a person of concern and, where legally permitted, be alerted if that person appears on the property. Next, on the recordings page, we make it easy to quickly find the footage you need. You can search using tags like vehicle color, make, model, or license plate. And for specific license plates, you can also set an alert to notify you whenever that vehicle returns to the property. Once you find the relevant footage, you can bookmark the clips using this bookmark tab and save them to a playlist, bringing related recordings together into one incident reel. And you can see the reels up here with the playlist bar. Finally, the reporting page. Management gets a clear view of security activity and performance across the property, from alerts and incidents to dispatches, deterrence, and estimated loss prevention, making it easy to understand what's happening and measure the impact of the security program. And that's how CloudStructure turns video surveillance into a proactive risk management tool, not just a way to watch a property. We give management the visibility to understand what's happening, the ability to respond in real time, and the reporting and documentation they need after an incident.
So in terms of the de-escalation process, I'd like to ask if you guys could kind of, to wrap things up, if there's one message that you had regarding domestic violence to those in attendance today, what would it be?
Melinda, you want to go first or you want me to go first?
I need to think. You go first.
Okay, no problem. No problem. So if there's one thing I could say, it's be consistent and document, but I'm going to throw in another one. So sorry, it's going to be two, maybe.
That's fair.
So the other key issue is that, like I mentioned towards the beginning, so often insurance companies are excluding assault and battery coverage or limiting it. So be very aware of that. Be aware that if it's excluded under your current coverage, you want to try and get coverage. And this is negotiable every year. Just because you didn't have coverage last year doesn't mean you can't get it this year, but make a point with your insurance broker that this is important to me, because this is not just it's not just an affordable housing problem. It's not just a low-income housing problem. This happens in households everywhere or in properties everywhere. So just making sure that you're protected, that the owners are protected, the property managers are protected, being consistent, documenting, saving video.
Thank you.
I mean,
Melinda?
that would pretty much be my takeaway too. Thank you, Megan. That's why I wanted you to go first, because I was
There you
hoping
go.
you would say the same thing I'm about to say. But it's documentation, consistency. When it comes to any type of lease violation, I will often describe it as bricks in a wall, right? Each incident or evidence is a brick. The higher the wall gets, the better a landlord's chances are of being able to evict the person or take action. So remember that there's not always going to be an instant solution to these. Sometimes, as hard as it is, you sort of have to sit back and document and let things pile up until it gets to a level where it is actionable. And particularly if you don't have any verification that there's domestic violence going on, you can sort of treat it as just your standard lease violation, noise disturbances, that kind of thing, unless and until you get more of the picture that develops, until you build the wall. Then you're ready to go. But you build the wall with your incident reports, with your security footage, with your witness statements, and with consistent, regular documentation in the files.
Thank you both. Yeah, I think it's, balancing your budget is important to do now so that you're not paying interest later, right? So that is that brick by brick mentality of just making sure that everything is documented and it's compassion over conclusions, but consistency and documentation remain the same always. If you're interested in learning more about CloudStructure, we'd be happy to kind of show you what this software solution looks like for your particular property. And then we also do have another webinar coming up. So we recently did our little residents. Now we are doing our graying residents. So everything seniors, safety, liability, and risk management for all types of housing. It doesn't have to be senior specific, can be class A, class B, just those who are entering the earlier or the later stages of their lives, and how we can address liability and risk management in those scenarios.
By the way, I wanted to include something. Sarah asked the question or made a statement that is very valid and that I would recommend having on your incident report, is that if someone comes to you with a report of domestic violence, having local resource centers, not just women's resource centers, men, this happens to men as well, but having resource center information is really great, right? Because that's a neutral source for someone. So we do recommend that people include that. Sarah, good point though. Thank you.
Wonderful that you pointed that out. Thank you. All right, so I know we've had some questions come through. There's a lot going on in the chat, so that's great. I'm glad that everybody was very engaged today. Let me see. Looks like Lori had asked, can someone claim VAWA because they want to transfer from a third floor unit to a first floor unit because their co-tenant doesn't help with the minor children getting them up and down the stairs and they lose their temper?
No. I mean, to me, in order to be a VAWA situation, there has to be a clearly identified abuser and a victim. Although in VAWA, there is different levels of verification that a tenant can provide. Obviously, you have the forms that are generated by HUD that you were supposed to give them. They can fill those out and sort of self-identify as a victim. If they're not even identifying themselves as a victim, then there is no VAWA there. Potentially, maybe they could submit a reasonable accommodation request, but that's only if they have some sort of mobility issues or documented disability that makes it hard for them to go up and down the stairs. I would not actually approve that VAWA request. VAWA would mean that they were transferring to get away from their abuser, not that they're just moving someplace with their abuser where they think maybe their abuser will be less abusive. I would deny that request.
Sure, and I will clarify, there was a little bit more to that question where there was some damage to the property and the loss of temper, but it doesn't appear that there is any physical harm to another individual.
Right. I mean, that would potentially be a lease violation for damage to the property. But unless and until the victim is identifying as a victim, and it seems to me like they are not now identifying as a victim, I don't really think there's much that you can do in that situation. I would treat the damage to the vandalization to the door as just a straight up lease violation unless and until you get more corroboration.
Great, thank you. And then another question came through that of what if you have two tenants that are both accusing each other of being the abuser?
That one's my favorite. In those situations, you as the landlord, it is not your job to choose sides or to pick who's the abuser and who's not the abuser. In that scenario, you really got to wait until a court or a judge gets involved, see who gets the restraining order, who is awarded use and possession of the property in the restraining order. I've actually one time I saw dueling restraining orders where each spouse went to a different courthouse in the county and got a restraining order against the other one. And they happened almost exact. I mean, I think within 5 minutes of each other, the orders were issued. And the wife had one giving her use and possession of the apartment, and the husband had one giving him use and possession of the apartment. I mean, in that scenario, the landlord cannot be the one to make that decision. The tenants had to go back to court and be like, hey, we have dueling protective orders here. What do we do? Put that decision and the burden of that decision on the courts and on a judge. Wait for a judge to issue an order telling you who you give the keys to and who you don't. If you make that choice on your own, a potential big liability issue coming down the pike for you.
Thank you. So I know we're up on time here. It's going to double check to see if there's anything else in the chat. But Melinda, Megan, want to thank you both for your time in today. We look forward to having you back. I know this is something that is very challenging to balance. So hearing from both of your perspectives, I hope gives everybody a little bit more empowerment to make the right decisions, force themselves to document things a little bit better if they aren't already, which I think we're all a little guilty of sometimes. Maybe not Belinda, she seems pretty thorough, but that's part of being counsel, right? But yeah, thanks everybody for joining. We certainly appreciate you spending some time with us today. If you have any questions, our contact information is listed on the screen here. All of us are more than happy to jump in and get you any answers that you need.
Thank you for coming, everybody. I know this is a difficult topic, but it's an important one to talk about as multifamily housing providers. It's something that you're going to deal with no matter what. This happens where people live, and people live in your properties. So it's important to understand how to address it. It's important to know that there is no one solution fits all, but hopefully you are armed with some tools today that will help you navigate these situations a little better in the future.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.